Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Western Spirit. Today, we have a very special guest, someone who I have to say, I think I watched you as a teenager while I was in the army, maybe not even a little bit older than a teenager in the army, in the bootcamp, watching videos of you on YouTube. So, so we have with us someone who I go back. He doesn't know me, but I know him for many, many years. Hillel Neuer is the executive director of United Nations Watch, known as also UN Watch, an NGO from Geneva, based in Geneva, that monitors the UN on the principles of its charter. And as I said to Hillel before, you have a lot of work to do. So Hillel, it's good to have you with us today.
Thank you for having me. Pleasure to be here.
So Hillel, obviously before October 7th, you had a lot of work to do. But I assume after October 7th, you've had double or triple the work that you've been doing. One of the things that maybe you can give us a rundown is, on October 7th, we saw UNRWA members, people who, in some cases, if I remember correctly, actually were wearing the uniform of UNRWA, going into kibbutzim and stuff, actually participating in the October 7th attack. Could you give us a little bit about what you guys are doing about this, where it is now? I know that some countries stopped the funding, then other countries put it back up. So give us a little bit of the rundown of what's happening on that front.
Okay, it's a big subject. I'll try to give you the initial snapshot. So indeed, as you said, well, just for people who don't know what UNRWA is the UN agency for Palestinians, created around 1949, meant to help Arabs who were displaced after the war with Israel's independence war. And these are Arabs who were living in what was then called Palestine, and then found themselves, because of the war, in Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, the West Bank or Judea and Samaria, and Gaza Strip. And initially, the idea was to help them resettle, to move on. The United States brought the world's leading development expert to help them lead a new life in the neighboring areas where they found them. These are neighboring Arab territories. If they were living in Ashkelon, then they lived in Gaza. If they were living in Haifa, they found themselves in Lebanon. So we're talking about 30, 40 miles away, maybe, with Arab neighbors who speak the same language, culturally the same, religiously the same, could easily have resettled. But they didn't want to be resettled. They said the jihad against the Jewish state must never end. And if we agree to start a new life in Lebanon, we're giving up on the jihad against the Jewish state. So very quickly, the Americans realized that none of these Arabs wanted to be resettled to begin a new life. And something pathological developed, where UNRWA became an agency not to resettle Palestinians, but to perpetuate them for generations as so-called refugees. Again, I say so-called because an Arab living in Gaza for 75 years, according to the United Nations, he's in Palestine. If you're living in Palestine, you're not a refugee. Okay, it may not be the exact home where your grandparents live, but you're in Palestine or in Jordan. 2 million of the Arabs who live there have Jordanian citizenship. Nothing in the world, nowhere in the world is there a concept of a citizen who's a refugee. So UNRWA is unique, and it's perverse and pathological. That's not a word that I invented. The Swiss foreign minister in 2018 visited Jordan. His name is Ignacio Cassis. He visited Jordan. He visited UNRWA refugee camps. Again, there's no tent, there's no camp. They're neighborhoods, and they're not refugees. But he said, the idea that we're paying for them, calling them refugees, he said, UNRWA is no longer the solution. It's the problem. He said, this is a perverse logic. I'm quoting the Swiss foreign minister. He said, UNRWA is a perverse logic. We're perpetuating the problem. So that's the background. Very quickly, October 7th, as you said, we know at least 19 of UNRWA so-called humanitarian aid workers were involved in the massacre. Were they wearing a uniform? No, there is no UNRWA uniform. UNRWA staff are teachers. They work in clinics. There's no actual uniform, but sometimes they have an UNRWA truck or something. And they were UNRWA staff people. There's an UNRWA social worker. He was kidnapping the body of Yonatan Samarano, who was killed in the Nova Music Festival. And his body was being kidnapped. You see it on a videotape shown by the Washington Post, of an UNRWA social worker. I'll mention one other, Mohammed Abu Itiwi. He at least drives a truck for UNRWA, and he was a commander of the Nukhba Hamas terrorist commandos at Summit Re'im. He was outside of kibbutz where Poland was kidnapped. People were killed. He was one of the commanders, and Israel gave his name in July of this year, July 2024. Israel gave 100 names to UNRWA. Here are the UNRWA staff, 100 names. Here are their ID numbers, and they are Hamas. And UNRWA said, well, we don't know. Well, a few months later, Israel eliminated in a missile to a truck of Mohammed Abu Itiwi. This is in, I think, October maybe. And UNRWA was like, oh, another UNRWA staff has been killed. Another humanitarian aid worker of the UN has been killed. This is what's been going on the past year.
And just on the point of the countries that stopped funding, I know a lot of countries did not. And I know that Switzerland, where you guys are based also, is they I think did stop and are still not funding UNRWA, right?
So it's been a bit of a roller coaster, and we've been at the center of it. UNRWA was never a huge issue for us, meaning we did reports for 10 years. We sent warnings every year since August 2015. Dear UNRWA, here are 10 names, here are 20 names of your teachers, of your school principals, of your staff members who on Facebook openly to the world are glorifying Adolf Hitler, celebrating Hamas, glorifying terrorist attacks, calling to slaughter Jews. UNRWA's response from the beginning was, don't listen to them. Their spokesman, Chris Gunn, has said, don't listen to them. Not true. This group, UN Watch, is against refugees. We're against people who celebrate Hitler and Hamas. We didn't say get rid of UNRWA. We said just fire teachers who celebrate jihadi terrorism and glorifying of Adolf Hitler. And they attacked us. They did nothing but attack us for 10 years. Finally, in January, to come to the issue you asked about, when it was revealed by Israel that at least 12, eventually 19, 12 UNRWA staff were involved in the massacre, suddenly we had a dramatic series of events. UNRWA announced that they fired them for PR purposes, not because they cared. UNRWA announced they fired them. The United States, this is approximately January 25, approximately. The United States announced that they were freezing funding. The United States was giving $300 million a year. The United States, they're freezing funding. Apparently, they asked their allies to join them. I don't have the documents, but it seems quite clear. They asked their allies to join them. Over the weekend, I was flying to Washington about to testify in a hearing about UNRWA terrorism. And Canada, Germany, France, about 15 countries. UNRWA, by the way, is funded by about 20 Western countries. That's deliberate. The Arabs, the Palestinians, they want Western countries to legitimize through their funding the UNRWA agenda, which is to dismantle Israel. About 15 or 17 countries froze their funding. So that was a huge headline. But Ariel, the moment that the freeze was announced, all of these countries were looking to climb down from the tree. They did not sincerely freeze the funding. It was because of, apparently they were asked by the US. They immediately figured out a way, how can we reinstate the funding? They created a fake audit, a fake review. It was called Colonna Review. Catherine Colonna is the former French foreign minister. She was the head of a review process. It was a fake, phony fraud. We documented it in a 20-page report. The head of the Colonna Review a month earlier had said, we need UNRWA more than ever. She, as French foreign minister, had given $60 million to UNRWA. She sat on the UNRWA board. She's the last person who could be independent and objective because she would be incriminating herself if she were to find wrongdoing. They hired 3 Scandinavian NGOs to help them, research institutes. A Scandinavian research institute, what could be more objective in the world, except each of these institutes, one is called CMI, one is called, perversely, the Raoul Wallenberg Institute. Raoul Wallenberg, as many people know, some don't know, was the Swedish diplomat who saved tens of thousands of Jews in Budapest under the Nazi occupation in 1944 during the Holocaust. An institute named after him in Sweden is actually a vehemently anti-Israel group, a ardently pro-UNRWA lobby group. So they picked the most ardently pro-UNRWA lobbyists to be the staff. Surprise, surprise, 2 months later in April, the Colonna Review came out. They said there are issues, but UNRWA is irreplaceable, indispensable, humanitarian, life-saving, backbone, lifeline. which is the mantra that UNRWA has been using for 10, 20 years. You will see Justin Trudeau and other foreign ministers reading off the UNRWA talking points. UNRWA is indispensable, irreplaceable, humanitarian, life-saving lifeline. They've been saying it for 10, 20 years. That was the conclusion of the so-called independent review. It was a fraud, but all the mainstream media regurgitated it as if this was gospel. They said, aha, we told you. Not only did they say UNRWA is clean, but they said UNRWA has the most robust accountability mechanisms of any other agency in the world. The audacity, the chutzpah is staggering. And when I testified in the Dutch parliament in June, I said, you know what? It may well be that UNRWA has mechanisms that are robust and all kinds of procedures and policies. You know what? The constitution of Joseph Stalin, the dictator in the 1930s, was hailed as the most democratic constitution in the world. And you know what? There were many provisions in his constitution, the Soviet constitution, that were democratic, but it was complete fiction. While he was putting out, constitutional freedoms and democratic rights on paper, in practice, he was killing hundreds of thousands of his own people, purging people. UNRWA is the same thing. UNRWA may have policies and procedures, but the reality is it is infested with terrorists and terrorist supporters. We have been putting out reports after reports. We have another report coming out very soon showing at various levels of the organization how it's completely infested with Hamas. I'll just mention one name and I'll stop my rant. But in Lebanon, the head of the UNRWA Teachers Union in Lebanon, head of a major school called the Deir Yassin School outside of Tyre, Lebanon, his name is Fathi Al-Sharif, for over a decade on his Facebook page with thousands of friends, many of them UNRWA managers and employees, he was celebrating Hamas. He posted pictures when he would make a simcha, when he would make a family celebration. Front row, these are pictures posted on social media on the internet, front row were leading terrorists of the jihad, of Hamas. This guy was waving red flags and black flags, telling the world, I'm a Hamas guy. We sent the dossier to UNRWA. They said, we don't know. We're investigating. We suspended him, but we don't know. I said, fire him now. We don't know. In October, in his second floor apartment, a missile came to visit him and justice was delivered to the UNRWA Teachers Union chair, head for decades of a major school. And when he was killed, Ariel, when he was killed, Hamas put out a statement, said, they killed our leader. Not an official, not a member, not a supporter, not a sympathizer. Our leader in Lebanon has been assassinated. They put out a video eulogizing him, pictures of him with Ismail Haniyeh visiting Lebanon. It turns out they praised his jihadi education. Fathi Al-Sharif, head of an UNRWA school, head of the teachers union in charge of 2,000 teachers, for decades was head of Hamas, and UNRWA wouldn't fire him. He is not he's not the bad apple. Indeed, the UNRWA is rotten to the core. There are many other examples like that.
So just before we go on, what countries that announced at the time they wouldn't fund are still not funding?
So United States suspended funding through an announcement of the administration. In March, the U.S. Congress passed a law initiated by the Republicans, but Democrats joined, signed by President Biden, to freeze funding until March 2025. So the United States, under law, cannot give any more money to UNRWA, even though the State Department, under Biden, still praises UNRWA. But under law, the U.S. is stopped funding. I trust that under President Trump and new incoming ambassador Elise Stefanik, Secretary of State Rubio, and others, the funding freeze will stay in place. That's the United States. Next, you mentioned Switzerland. Quite right. On I believe around September 14th, roughly, the Swiss lower house, National Assembly, voted, I think it was 99 to 88, something like that. But it was a large majority voted to defund UNRWA. And I'm going to quote, to immediately suspend funding for UNRWA. An incredible announcement from Switzerland, the guardian of international humanitarian law, the protector of the Geneva Conventions, and also the sponsor of Philippe Lazzarini, the Commissioner General of UNRWA, is a Swiss citizen. To get that job means he's sponsored by Switzerland. It's a huge slap in the face to UNRWA. It now goes to the Swiss Senate. They met recently and they voted to invite me again because I was invited in April to testify. They invited me. I testified in the lower house Foreign Affairs Committee. Now on January 20th, I can announce here on this program that I've just confirmed my testimony. I haven't mentioned it before, confirmed my testimony to the Swiss Senate in January. We hope that funding freeze will be permanent. Finally, I hope not finally, but third, for now, just a few days ago on Thursday, the Dutch Parliament, where I appeared in June,
Yes.
the Dutch Parliament voted, I think it was 88 to 49, something like that. They voted to begin phasing out funding for UNRWA over the next 4 years. Next year was supposed to be 19 million. It gets cut to, I think, 15 million. And the message was very clear. And they cite in the motion, they cite UNRWA's complicity with terrorism, including the Telegram chat group that we exposed that had 3,000 UNRWA teachers celebrating October 7th.
Wow.
While it was happening, 3,000 UNRWA teachers celebrating, praising the attack. Similarly, in the Swiss motion that was adopted in September, they cited our reports on complicity with terrorism as the reason why they're funding. So it's very important. The mainstream media hardly reports this, but not only did they freeze funding, but they explicitly cited the reasons being UNRWA's documented complicity with terrorism. Those are the three countries.
So all the other countries basically went back after the report that you cited, the bogus report by someone who was biased. These three, you explained 3 NGOs that were biased 100% before. They all decided we're going to continue funding. I want to ask you something, maybe just from behind the scenes, when you talk to people from these countries, from their bureaucracies. Why do they think it's so important? Why are they fighting to fund? It's their taxpayers' money. Shouldn't they be more, prudent about where they're throwing their money around?
I can tell you what they tell me.
Yeah.
What they tell me is what they say publicly. They'll say anything we bring, they'll say that's just a few bad apples. I was in a large Norwegian-speaking country. I don't want to say which one, but a large Norwegian-speaking country in Europe. And the head of the foreign ministry told me, yeah, it's just a few bad apples. It's just 0.0%, even though we've shown that it's hundreds of people in UNRWA who are implicated in terrorism. So they say it's just a few, and UNRWA is necessary. It does vital humanitarian work. And that's what they say. That's their line. And I need to add that they have zero interest in asking us for documentation. Again, these are the foreign ministries giving out hundreds of millions of dollars from all the Western countries. They never contact us to say, oh my gosh, I'm shocked that Germany gave 200 million. I'm the German foreign ministry. Can you send us information about where our money's going? Never. Not one country, not even the State Department, never asked us for documents showing systematic, widespread complicity with terrorism by UNRWA staff.
Let me just ask you, I remember I read not too long ago about an event that happened where the Director General of UNRWA, or whatever it's called, that you just mentioned his name, was at an event, and the mother of one of the hostages that I think was killed and his body was taken, give us the exact, when I finish my question, she stood up and basically showed her on her, took off her jacket, and on the shirt it said, I think, if I remember, UNRWA kidnapped my son. And then it turned out that she was in contact with you. And give us a little bit about behind the scenes and what exactly happened there.
I brought her there. She flew on her own, but we invited her, and I was her host. So her name is Ayelet Samarano. Her son is Jonathan Samarano, 21 years old, innocent young man killed at the Nova Music Festival by Hamas terrorists. His lifeless body was kidnapped into Gaza by an UNRWA social worker. And we've never found out what happened to him. Where is his body? We don't know. So that's Ayelet Samarano for the past year. She's been speaking out very courageously. She came to our conference in February, the summit to replace UNRWA. She spoke and made a very emotional appeal. She came to our press conference in Paris, the same in March of this year. And then in August 1st, I called Ayelet. I said, Ayelet, I'm very sad to report that the Swiss city of Lausanne, which is near me because I live in Geneva, but the Swiss city of Lausanne, a beautiful city, magnificent views of the Alps and Lake Geneva, the mayor, a socialist mayor, invited Philippe Lazzarini to be honored at the Swiss National Day, their Independence Day. And it's a day to unite people and have fireworks. It's just a celebration along the lake in a public square. And despicably, they invited the head of an agency that is known to be tied to terrorism. So shameful because, the Jewish community in Lausanne, they wrote to the mayor. They said, how can you do this? Also non-Jews who care about these issues. How can you do this? This is divisive. On the national day, it should unite people. And when they said it's divisive, literally it's divisive because it was in the parliament. Half the parliament had voted. And this was on August 1st, but even last year, in the end of 2023, in December 2023, there were 3 times the Swiss lower house voted in favor of defunding UNRWA. So it was literally divisive. And the mayor, the socialist mayor, said, I don't care. He's a great Swiss humanitarian. I'm inviting him. So he invited him. I called Ayelet. I said, Ayelet, I'm embarrassed, but this person is coming next to my city. Would it be meaningful for you to come and appear in front of him? She said, yes, Hillel, it would be. So we arranged for her to come. She came. She had a jacket. Underneath was a T-shirt. Indeed, as you said, the moment Philippe Lazzarini began speaking, she removed her jacket, and the T-shirt said, UNRWA kidnapped my son. Where is he, Mr. Lazzarini? And she began to cry out, UNRWA kidnapped my son. He didn't stop his lecture. He didn't look at her. It was quite despicable. And the video and the photos went viral, was shared certainly on Israeli TV networks and also by President Bougie Herzog. And I think it influenced the Knesset when they decided to outlaw UNRWA in Israel.
Yes, they decided, I think, only in East Jerusalem. Let me ask about that just because I think that's the only places we really have control of.
It's a bit more than that. I'll just say there are 2 laws.
Yeah.
One law banned UNRWA premises within Israel. So indeed, as you said, there's a headquarters and there's Shuafat. So that's one element. But the other element is that Israeli officials are not allowed to deal with UNRWA. And that means the UNRWA facilities that require Israeli cooperation in Yudav Shomron, in Judea and Samaria and the West Bank, and in Gaza, UNRWA, in order to access those places, needs cooperation from Israeli officials, and that's been outlawed. So it remains to be seen how they will operate in those areas.
Yeah, I saw recently that the organization wrote a report that said that the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, and I can't read his name because I don't know how to pronounce it. Volker Turk condemned Israel more than any other country in the world. So, I mean, we're seeing right now what's happening in Syria. Today, where I live, we had sirens. We have to go to the bomb shelters from the Houthis, which we know there's hunger and death and torture and underage female genital mutilation. Egypt is right next to us. There's, I think, 80-90% female genital mutilation. We have it's horrible. The world is a disgusting place. I mean, and how do you explain? I mean, you live the UN, so how do you explain this? Is it just politics that there's more countries that are willing to hate Israel and band together, and therefore these organizations feel they have to, kiss, or they really do feel that Israel is the biggest problem in the world?
Well, I think, you identified 2 separate phenomena related. One is the relative inaction, indifference, silence in the face of horrific abuses in the countries you mentioned. In the neighborhood, Yemen, indeed, millions suffer from malnutrition. Egypt, horrible human rights record where there are tens of thousands of political prisoners. And you go around the world, North Korea, prison camps, Russia, carpet bombing Ukraine, Syria, where 500,000 people had been killed with these torture chambers, and the list goes on and on. We have silence against horrific abuses around the world. In Russia, China, where there's 1.5 billion people denied any form of freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of assembly, 1 million Uyghurs in camps. So why the silence and inaction? And that's part one. The second part is why the obsession with scapegoating Israel. On part one, the silence, I would say most countries are not courageous, and the norm at the UN is to be silent. That is the norm. If you're at the General Assembly, the countries we mentioned, each year there's only a handful of countries get condemned once. North Korea gets one for obvious reasons. Syria got one. Iran, I think Myanmar, and maybe one other country. About 5 countries get condemned once, and then Israel gets condemned 17 times. But 190 countries, approximately 185 countries, get 0, meaning 0 on Saudi Arabia, 0 on Pakistan, 0 Cuba, 0 Venezuela, 0 China. Why the zeros? That's the norm. The norm is, you are Belgium, you are Peru, you are Singapore. You're just looking out for your interests. You don't want to make trouble. You don't want to upset powerful countries that have armies, that have terrorists on their side, that have UN votes they could use against you. The norm at the United Nations is to be silent. That's the norm. A handful of countries are horrible, and there's public pressure in the West to criticize them. I mentioned Iran and Syria. You get one resolution each. And then the other topic is the obsession, almost like a ritual, where the world meets and they condemn the Jew. And then they pat themselves on the back and they say, the Human Rights Council is working just fine. We held an emergency session on Israel. We created a commission of inquiry on Israel. The human rights groups will say, great, it shows that the mechanisms are working because we condemned the only Jewish state more than the rest of the world combined, right? So there's more condemnations against Israel at the General Assembly than the rest of the world combined. The Human Rights Council, more or less the same thing. So why the obsession with Israel? Just in a nutshell, number one, it's the Arab and Islamic states who bring the resolutions. They have 56 votes. The Islamic nations have 56 votes. They have oil. If you don't vote for us, you don't get our oil. If you don't vote for us, you don't get our 56 votes. We have billions in sovereign wealth funds. Qatar, you want Qatari money, you better vote the right way. And fear of terrorism. If my country in Latin America, in Southeast Asia, or in Africa will vote and join one of a handful of countries that stand with Israel, maybe we'll be targeted by Al-Qaeda, ISIS, Hezbollah, who knows? All of those, Ariel, are what I call rational reasons. We may not like them, they might be cynical, but they're rational. It's self-interest. 56 Islamic countries, 1 Jewish country, 56 to 1. Sorry, 1 country. Sorry, Israel, you're outnumbered. I'd like to help you, but it's going to hurt me. Sorry. Rational realpolitik. But I would be lying to you if I said that that's the only reason, because I see countries when they vote against Israel, and it's not only the broad majority that vote against Israel. It's not only the Islamic countries, not only the Arab countries, not only the dictatorships, the Chinas, the Cubas, the Venezuelas. It's also many democracies. 2/3 of EU countries, virtually all the EU countries support 2/3 of the condemnations in the General Assembly, meaning if there's 15 a year, 10 of them will be supported by France, Belgium, and most other EU countries, even Germany. Germany might be a little better on one of them, but basically voting for these. And for many of these countries, look at Ireland, which of course has initiated to join the genocide case against Israel. When I see these countries voting against Israel, I don't see their hands saying, it's not fair, it's totally biased to support a one-sided resolution to scapegoat Israel, but I'm forced because the money and the votes and the fear of terrorism. No, I see many of them, their hands go up very, very comfortably in demonizing the Jewish state. And when I live in Europe, I am mindful of the fact that 1,000 years ago, less in the Middle Ages, there was the Black Plague, people were dying across Europe, and the instinct in Europe was to say the Jews poisoned the wells, demonize, scapegoat the Jews. And in our time, when there's trouble in the world, economic crisis, wars, instability, insecurity, there is an instinct today in modern times to say, let's scapegoat the Jewish state, the only Jewish country, and to say they've poisoned the wells. They're the cause of racism, genocide, war, human rights abuse. And I have to tell you, that is not an insignificant element. The realpolitik reasons are real, but the supra-rational reasons, irrational reasons, where Israel is treated, in the words of the late historian Jacob Talmon, Israel is treated today as the Jew among the nations.
But if you have behind the scenes conversations with some of these people, with the ambassadors or do they anytime explain the discrepancy between the amount of, like you said, 17 for Israel, 1 for Iran? Do they have any explanation of why they would go along with this? Or is it just their explanation to you would be, this is realpolitik, we want to get along with everyone. What's the harm of another condemnation for Israel?
Good question. Look, very few ambassadors will be candid and say, I'm doing this for cynical reasons. Very few. It can happen sometimes. The Canadian foreign minister has been telling people, and it was published in a newspaper, she was asked by the former Socialist Party, a guy named Thomas Mulcair, who's head of Canada's Socialist Party called the NDP, but actually a supporter of Israel, the old kind of socialist who actually believes in equal rights for people and believes in women's rights and understands who Hamas is. He met with Melanie Joly, the Canadian foreign minister, and he asked her, he said, I don't understand your policy on the international court case against Israel, very unclear. And he basically challenged her on her anti-Israel policies, because Canada the past year has become very anti-Israel. They imposed an arms embargo against Israel. Hamas praised them. Okay. He asked her about it, and he wrote this in the National Post of Canada. And she said, look, Tom, my district in Canada and England, we call it my riding, my district, the demography. Did you see, the demography of my electoral district? Namely, she was saying, I have a lot of Arabs and Muslims in my district, and c'est comme ça, that's how it is. In other words, she was telling him, my policy on whether to support an international legal proceeding, which is initiated by South Africa, which is completely hostile and biased and false, her decision was not motivated by international law, not by the precedents, not by the merits, but did you see the demography of my district? So that is a rare case where, and Thomas Mulcair was not the first person she said that to. I've heard it from other people. So she tells people, I'm doing it for cynical electoral reasons. In my experience, very few ambassadors, it can happen once in a while, but generally ambassadors don't like to admit that. Sometimes they'll say, they might hint that they're under pressure, but generally they don't want to talk about it. They get very embarrassed by these things. I remember I met a deputy ambassador of a large Spanish-speaking country in Europe. I'm not going to say which one, but a large Spanish-speaking country in Europe. And I met the deputy ambassador, and I told her exactly this question. I said, Madam Ambassador, how can you support the majority of, at the time there were about 20 resolutions against Israel, when there's only 1 on Iran and so forth, and 0 on China and Saudi and all that? And she said, well, I said, it's demonizing, it's unfair. She said, well, but Israel, we support international law, and Israel is an occupier. So that was her answer. So I said to her, well, if the reason for the discrepancy why you would support 20 resolutions because Israel is an occupier, do you support any resolutions on Turkey in northern Cyprus, on Morocco and Western Sahara, on Armenia and Azerbaijan, and all the other countries that under international law are officially occupation? Ariel, she got very nervous. Asked her a simple question. Well, if that's the reason, then what about are you applying a double standard or not? And she got very nervous. She said, oh, no, are you saying they're the same? They're not the same? I said, no. You said that's the reason. And basically the short answer is they don't want to talk about it. If they do talk about it, they say nonsense. There is no coherent explanation. My friend Eugene Kontorovich, the international law expert, challenged European countries, him and Avi Bell, several years ago, which were boycotting or putting special labels on products coming from Judea and Samaria. And they said, because if it's from occupied territories, we're going to put a special label on the tomato, something they didn't do anywhere else in the world in its exact similar circumstances. And when they were asked, the EU said in a letter, it's different. Okay, how is it different? No answer. It's different. So it's different. I'll just end with one thing on the difference, right? Amnesty International, about more than 10 years ago, had done a 130-page report on Islamophobia. Fine. There was a meeting in England. Someone at their annual meeting said, let's do a report on anti-Semitism in Europe. And they voted against doing that. On Twitter, someone asked Amnesty, why did you vote against doing a major report on anti-Semitism after you had done a 100-page report on anti-Semitism? And their answer was, on Twitter, well, you can't campaign on everything, okay? You can't campaign on everything. But then 5 years ago, their first report accusing a country of apartheid was Israel. And when the head of Amnesty came to Jerusalem to present their false report accusing Israel of apartheid, the Times of Israel, Lazar Berman, asked Agnes Calamard and Philip Luther, tell me, why is it that all around the world there's racism, there's a million Uyghur Muslims in camps? You didn't do a report on apartheid in China or dozens of other places. Why did you do this report first on Israel? I said, well, you got to start somewhere. So when it comes to Israel, you're the first. You got to start somewhere. Why do you refuse to do anti-Semitism? Can't do everything.
Yeah. Hillel, another thing of double standard is something that you also talked about. The ICJ, the court where you mentioned South Africa brought this, I think, blood libelous, I think there's no other really word to call it. Plus, it seems obvious to me that they're doing it on behalf of other countries that can't do it, that are really the worst of the worst, like Iran and other haters. But then the new Chief Justice, if you want to call it, of the court, he is the former Lebanese ambassador to the UN, if I'm not mistaken. And you wrote in your reports and have highlighted the fact that he, in his past, not too long ago, called Israel like a genocidal country and all these other things. And now he's sitting on the case that's accusing Israel of doing genocide. And I want to ask, was there any attempt to tell him that he's in a conflict of interest? Other judges on courts next to my house, we have a courthouse. If a judge would say something like that about me, I would demand that he recuse himself. But he's not recusing himself.
That's right. Well, you're quite right. I used to be a lawyer in New York State, worked on human rights cases. Indeed, if you go before a judge and that judge has pronounced himself or herself against your client in public ways, the first thing you would do is to do a motion that to request the judge recuse himself or herself. If the judge would deny it, you would appeal, and in 2 seconds, that judge would be disqualified. So too in this case, we published a report, as you mentioned, documenting, I think it was more than 100 times, when as ambassador of Lebanon, he voted for condemnations of Israel and accused Israel of the worst crimes. And he's sitting on a proceeding where, and he represented a country. Again, Lebanon sponsored him to be there. He was even considered, while he was sitting on the court, he was considered to be the president of Lebanon. His candidacy was not, he didn't deny it. His name was floated. And first Hezbollah opposed him, but then Hezbollah said, oh, no, he might be okay. So this is a guy who's clearly disqualified by any rational measure, and no one in The Hague seems to care at all. Our report got some coverage, but in The Hague, they couldn't care less.
And just in general about The Hague, which is, I think, under UN auspicion, is it like, when you're looking at the cases there, do you think that Israel can even think of getting a fair trial, or is it a sold court? We know pretty much what is going to happen. So maybe it was even a mistake to send lawyers to the court.
Right. So first, let's clarify, when we say The Hague, there's more than one court there. There's two different courts.
Yeah.
There's the International Court of Justice, the ICJ, that is under the UN auspices. It's the highest court of the UN, also known as the World Court. That deals with disputes between countries. And it's in that court that South Africa brought this blood libel case, falsely accusing Israel of genocide. It's also the place where there was an advisory opinion to declare that Israel's presence in Judea and Samaria is illegal. Yeah. That's the ICJ. And then there's the International Criminal Court, which is much newer, because the ICJ has been around for well over a century. It used to be the permanent court on international arbitration, but it's been around for decades. ICC is only about 25 years old, and that's the International Criminal Court. That is not under UN auspices, but it is affiliated in some ways. And should Israel have sent representation? Look, it's always a dilemma on these things. It's an ongoing dilemma. When you have a biased court, on one hand, you say you shouldn't appear because you might legitimize it, exactly as you said. On the other hand, you could say, well, maybe if you don't show up, you can damage yourself, and maybe just showing up and filing a piece of paper might make the problem go away. And how damaging would our absence be? And you have to weigh cost-benefit in each case. And I don't have the answer for you on the ICJ. Israel did appear They did appear there, certainly Israel did appear. And in the ICC, they are there. There's arrest warrants. And as far as I understand, Israel, the individuals who are being pursued for their arrest, the prime minister and the defense minister, the former defense minister, I believe they're trying to appeal or to challenge those arrest warrants. And I agree with you. It's a dilemma, and it's a perpetual dilemma because if they have teeth, the ICC does have teeth. The arrest warrant means that it is complicated for those two individuals, the prime minister and Gallant, the former defense minister, to travel to countries that are signatories. It does make their life complicated, and it is a threat that could be used against other Israelis. So it's a dilemma, and I don't have the answer.
And do you think that on the ICC question, the question of the arrest warrants, so right after it happened, Israel started pressuring, and I assume you guys were working behind the scenes too, pressuring different countries to say that they wouldn't abide by the ruling. Countries, for example, if I'm not mistaken, even Germany and France put out, France probably with the ceasefire in Lebanon was used as leverage against them, but they put out, we're not really going to enforce this if Netanyahu or Gallant comes to France or to Germany. Other countries said, yeah, we're going to arrest Netanyahu if he comes. Do you think that maybe now with Trump coming in, that countries will be a little more hesitant of saying we're going to arrest one of America's best friends?
Yes, I do think so. And it's also that the Congress has threatened sanctions.
Yes.
You can be sure there are people in the Senate and the House that are looking very eager to sanction the ICC and anyone who does business with them. So I think people are going to have to think twice before they go along with such anti-Israel bodies, unless they want to operate in a world where they can't have any financial interaction with anything in the United States. They can never visit the United States. Very few people in the world who are active, who are sophisticated, want that scenario. So I think we are in a new world come January 20th.
I want to ask you about something that I found funny. There's this woman, UN something, human rights. It's like redundant, but Francesca Albanese, I think her name is, and I knew about her after she started doing interviews, and you hear UN something. It's very important. It sounds like she knows what she's talking about, and then when you just like listen to the words, you hear that she's pretty much like. I think she's anti-Semite. She hates Jews. She hates Israel. It seems very obvious from everything she says. And you even explained that she took money from Hamas affiliated. Explain to us exactly and what her significance maybe is.
Well, what we know is that Francesca Albanese is the UN Special Rapporteur on the Palestinian territories. That means an investigator. She's a UN investigator. She does not receive a salary, but it has significance because she has that title. And the position is only to examine Israel. The position was created in 1993, in February 93, meaning before Oslo. Hasn't changed, meaning even though the situation on the ground changed dramatically from September 1993, the position hasn't changed. It's to investigate Israel's violations of the bases and principles of international law in the territories. So Israel only is examined, not Hamas, not the Jihad, not the Palestinian Authority, only Israel. And Israel's actions are presumed in advance to be violations. That's her job. Whoever holds the job, that's the job. The job itself is inherently biased. Okay, who do they pick? Well, they pick people, a number of years ago, they picked a 9/11 conspiracy denier, meaning a conspiracy supporter, Richard Falk, who supported 9/11 conspiracy people, who said that America plotted to blow up the Empire State Building. And Francesca Albanese is an overt anti-Semite, meaning 10 years ago, she published on Facebook, she said, America is subjugated by the Jewish lobby. I'm going to say that again. She didn't say the Zionists. She didn't say Israel. She said America is controlled, is subjugated by the Jewish lobby. So this is textbook medieval anti-Semitism, and which you could read in the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. She has told Hamas conferences in November 2022, you have the right to resist. So she was encouraging a year before the massacre, you have the right to resist, as you said, in the name of the UN. So you can't get more shameful than her. And she is tweeting every hour the worst lies about Israel. She said Israel killed 180,000 people in Gaza. just making things up. A UN rapporteur is supposed to carefully weigh evidence, show it to the country concerned, deliberate. She's the complete opposite. Any mud she sees, she throws it. And she, of course, is celebrated by Israel haters around the world, by anti-Semites around the world. If anyone goes on her Twitter account, x.com, and click reply and say, oh, I disagree with you, you will bring upon yourself all kinds of anti-Semitic hate from her followers. So that's Francesca Albanese. She accused Israel of genocide. She's been doing it for a decade. It's not new. For a decade, she said the Palestinians have been suffering like the Jews under the Nazis. So this is an obsession with her. And we exposed the fact, as you mentioned, that a year ago she was invited to Australia by pro-Hamas groups, a group that praised Yahya Sinwar when he died. They eulogized him. And the groups brought her to Australia and they said, we sponsored her trip. UN experts not supposed to be sponsored by a trip. They said this Palestinian group sponsored her trip to Adelaide, to this city in Australia, but we're the ones who sponsored this group called Australian Friends of Palestine, AFOPA. We sponsored her trip to Australia. We calculated she lives in Tunisia actually, flying from Tunisia to Australia with her assistant, Sarah Troyan, costs about $20,000. And she never answered how she could take money from a group. And we found out that her assistant, Sarah Troyan, who now is starting her own anti-Israel activities independently of Albanese, she was based in the Netherlands at an institute connected to Erasmus University, where they would give invoices and they were outside donors. Who is donating to Francesca Albanese? We don't know. They haven't given the information. We're trying to find it.
Mm-hmm. I want to ask you a very weird question. As you're talking, this would probably put you out of business, but do you think that if you had to start over now, would it be prudent to, demolish the building in Manhattan and try to start over? Or is there something worth saving in this organization?
Look, it's a very good question. More than ever before, we can ask this question because let's look at the top. Antonio Guterres, who we thought maybe was decent the past year, embraces the Hamas narrative all the time. After the massacre of October 7th, weeks later, he said, yes, I condemn Hamas, but he said the attacks didn't happen in a vacuum.
Yes.
He went on to enumerate alleged Palestinian grievances against Israel over the years. He was legitimizing, he was justifying Hamas. This is the head of the UN early on in October, setting the tone for the rest of the UN. So your question, is there anything left of the UN to salvage? I don't know. Look, the UN is not going anywhere. It has a refugee agency, telecommunications agency, culture, World Health. It's not going anywhere. And the problem is broader than the UN because the UK just gave more money to UNRWA. After everything I just told you published a few days ago, Prime Minister Starmer brought Philippe Lazzarini to his office in London, and he said, I love UNRWA, I'm giving you more money. So you can get rid of the UN, but the UK, France, Germany, forget about Ireland, Luxembourg, Spain, they're going to find another mechanism to replicate. So the UN is a terrible part of this, especially because of the dictatorships, but even the democracies, sadly, they play a part in some of the pathologies of the UN. So it's a very difficult beast to confront.
Finally, Hill, maybe you can give us a little bit background. Why did you decide, you said you were a lawyer in New York on human rights. Why did you decide to suddenly, maybe it's not suddenly, but why did you decide to form a group, an NGO that would monitor the UN? What happened? Why did you go to this route? Okay,
well, a few things. First, I'm not the one who founded UN Watch. People know me from UN Watch because I've been there for 20 years. So they forget a little bit the decade that came before, but it's important for me to recall that UN Watch was founded in 1993 by one of the great civil rights leaders of the movement to get equal rights for African Americans, Morris Abram, a Jewish lawyer born in a small town in Georgia, grew up, became a lawyer, served on the Nuremberg war tribunals of Nazi war criminals in 1945 in the post-war era. Then in Georgia, he was a lawyer in Atlanta, worked very closely with Martin Luther King, not in the 60s when it was cool, In the 1950s, when it was bad for your career, when it was unpopular, he was helping get Martin Luther King out of prison. So that's our founder, Maurice Abram. He was U.S. ambassador in Geneva to the United Nations European headquarters. He created UN Watch in 1993. He believed in the UN because he himself drafted the UN Convention Against Racism in 1964. So he was someone who very much believed in the role of the UN, but he saw how it became hijacked by dictators, terrorists, and their Western apologists. So he created UN Watch to fight anti-Semitism, but also to fight for human rights around the world. I joined in 2004. Indeed, as you said, I had been a lawyer for a few years in New York, but the truth is that for many years, for a number of years, I was only 32 or about 32, 33. I had already for about over a decade, I was involved in activism, fighting against human rights abuses. As a lawyer, I was active for civil rights in my practice in New York, and also fighting against anti-Semitism on campus and writing articles. So I knew that I wanted to do interesting things. I was inspired by one of my teachers, Professor Erwin Kotler, one of the great human rights lawyers of our time, and a great defender of Jewish rights around the world. So that was my role model. I was thinking of that sort of activity. And then I got an email from my friend at the law firm, said, Hillel, the position at UN Watch is open. It's for you. This is what you're meant to do. And I said, you know what? I'd love to do it, but will I ever go to Geneva? What's in Geneva? I took the adventure, and now it's been 2 decades, and it's kept me busy. And this year, indeed, the same kind of work, but on steroids the past year.
Hillel, just before we finish, can you give us, there's all these weird things like Iran is the head of the human rights. I don't know exactly, but can you give us a little bit of like crazy stuff that you've seen since you've come to the UN, like a few anecdotes that just for our viewers and listeners about human rights, countries who are patently anti-human rights, controlling human rights, countries who are very against women, stuff like that. Give us just so we understand how ridiculous
I'm going to give you just a snapshot, just a brief sample, and the brief sample will be 17 hours. Okay? That's going to be the brief sample. I'm joking. I'm going to give you the 30-second and 1-minute version. Currently on the Human Rights Council, the highest human rights body of the UN, 60% are dictatorships and other non-democracies. The Chinese Communist Party sitting on the Human Rights Council, the Cuban police state, Eritrea where they have slave labor, Qatar which sponsors terrorists. These are the dominant members of the Human Rights Council. Let's move to last year. They had an appointment. They appointed the Islamic regime of Iran to be chair of the Human Rights Council's Social Forum, right? A regime that beats, blinds, tortures, and rapes women for standing up for their rights. That regime was named chair of the Human Rights Council's Social Forum. Then you have the Disarmament Committee, which meets in Geneva several times a year. The chair last year was also the Islamic regime of Iran. That was not an election. That's a rotation, but still, the world didn't seem to mind when Syria was the chair of disarmament, when North Korea was the chair of disarmament, when the Islamic regime of Iran was the chair of disarmament. The Syrian regime of Bashar Assad was named to the UN Decolonization Committee, right? This is Syria, which was a colony of Iran, all right, a colony of Russia, was head of the Decolonization Committee fighting against the subjugation of peoples. They had torture chambers of the most unspeakable, horrific kind, and they were at the UN rapporteur of the committee fighting decolonization. The World Health Organization, about a year ago, named North Korea, which has the worst health system on the planet, to their executive board. Finally, I'll just mention, about 3 years ago, the Islamic regime of Iran was named a member of the UN Women's Rights Commission. The current chair is Saudi Arabia.
Wow.
That's the short sample.
It's not, when you hear this stuff, you want to laugh, but then you realize that, number one, our Western countries' tax dollars are going to these groups. And number two, even more disturbing, is that a lot of Western countries play along with this. They go to these committees. They sit there. They listen. They listen with a straight face. One of the things that I really enjoyed from you guys do is, at least in the past, telling you go to these committees. You get, as our NGOs, the opportunity to speak, and you tell them to their face how ridiculous this whole, it's a clown show, and everybody's looking at it like it's a serious thing. And I think that one of the things, just to finish it off, that you guys do in such a good way is that you're able to put, a screen, a mirror to the face of these organizations. And it seems that if you weren't there, no one would be doing it. And it's very, very, it's disturbing.
Look, it is disturbing. I mentioned the case when the Islamic regime in Iran was elected to the UN Women's Rights Commission. No one said a thing. No journalist said anything. Reuters, Associated Press, Agence France Presse, silent. They don't like these stories. They sit at the UN. They like to echo, to parrot the UN narrative, and really just being stenographers. And we were the first and the only ones to report it. Then it went viral because there are enough people around the world who care. That happens time and again. So indeed, our role is essential in that regard. And, it's not just that the Western countries attend and legitimize. In many cases, they participate. Yeah. We're now speaking about Ireland, which joined the false, libelous case accusing Israel of genocide launched by South Africa. Ireland said, well, what can you do? We're pro-human rights. We are pro-human rights. We must do this. Guess what, Ireland? In 2017, we exposed the fact that you, Ireland, you voted in a secret ballot to elect Saudi Arabia to be chair of the UN Women's Rights Commission. And at the time, Ireland refused to admit but we know that they voted for them. And they said, well, we need to keep our ballot secret. But they said, we raise it quietly. We raise it quietly with them. When we meet with them, I went to Saudi Arabia, said the foreign minister, Charles Flanagan. I raised it quietly in sensitive diplomatic relations. Meanwhile, that's 2017. In 2019, Saudi Arabia voted for Ireland to join the Security Council. And why did they do it? According to the headline, it said Saudi diplomats were grateful that the Irish diplomats don't lecture them on human rights. So the great Irish government, the pro-human rights, same government, this government doesn't lecture Saudi Arabia after they sent, thousands of bombs on Yemen, where millions face malnutrition, women's rights are trampled, dissidents like Raif Badawi, an innocent blogger, is in prison, got out of prison after 10 years. Now he can't leave the country. This is the country that Ireland wouldn't lecture on human rights, and they elected them to the Women's Rights Commission. So as I said, not only do they attend, not only do they legitimize, they participate secretly. It's the height of cynicism, and they have the audacity to then accuse the only democracy in the Middle East of human rights violations. Shame on you, Ireland.
I agree. And I want to just say that I thank you guys for your work that you do. It's important, and it's important for everyone to know about you. And I assume there's places where people could donate to you guys and support you. So I call on everyone to do so. And it's extremely important what you guys are doing. And there's no one else that's doing it pretty much. So you are the people, for I think we could say millions of people all over the world who find it ridiculous all the things that we just mentioned. So thank you so much for being with us, Hillel Neuer. It's a pleasure, and it's an honor, and it's an important thing that you're doing. So thank you.
Thank you very much. I'll just add to that. I really appreciate it. Our website is unwatch.org. I invite everyone just to sign up. If you sign up, you will become informed about these horrific injustices and abuses and how you can help. We have campaigns, as you mentioned. We got the US, Netherlands, Switzerland to vote to defund UNRWA. We expose abuses by the Islamic regime in Iran and other dictatorships. Sign up at unwatch.org. It really makes a difference.
Hillel, thank you so much for being with us. And thank you guys for being with us too. We'll see you on our next episode. Thanks for tuning in to the Western Spirit podcast. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. And hit that notification bell so you never miss an episode. See you next time.